It was a gloomy November night, the kind where the rain seemed to pour sideways and the cold seeped into your bones. I was driving back from my parents' house in northern Idaho after spending the weekend with them. The trip should have taken about 5 hours, but the relentless rain made the drive feel endless. The highway was nearly empty, just me and the occasional semi-truck. My wipers struggled to keep up with the rain, and the headlights barely pierced the darkness. I was exhausted but determined to push through and make it home before midnight. About 2 hours into the drive, I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, drenched from head to toe, her long hair plastered to her face. She was waving one arm weakly while holding what looked like a small suitcase in the other. For a moment, I thought about driving past her. Picking up hitchhikers, especially late at night, wasn't something I ever did. But there was something about her, maybe the way she was shivering, or how fragile she looked, that made me slow down. I pulled over and rolled down the passenger window just enough to talk. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, shouting over the sound of the rain. She nodded, her teeth chattering. "Please," she said, her voice barely audible. My car broke down. Against my better judgment, I unlocked the door. She climbed in, clutching her suitcase tightly, and I turned the heat up to full blast. She was younger than I'd expected, maybe in her early 20s, wearing a thin jacket that was completely soaked through. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Just up the road," she said, staring straight ahead. Her voice was flat, almost monotone. "Thank you for stopping. Not many people would." "It's no problem," I said, though my gut was starting to twist. Something about her felt off. She didn't offer any more information, and I didn't press her. The rain pounded against the car, filling the silence between us. Every so often, I glanced over at her, but she never looked back. Her grip on the suitcase was so tight that her knuckles were white. After about 15 minutes of driving, I couldn't take the silence anymore. "So, where are you coming from?" I asked. She hesitated before answering. "Visiting family." Her answer felt rehearsed, like she was trying to remember a script. I nodded and focused back on the road, but the unease in my chest wouldn't go away. The next thing I noticed was the smell. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger the longer she sat there, a damp, earthy smell, like wet leaves mixed with something metallic. I glanced at her again, noticing for the first time how pale she was. Her lips were almost blue, and her eyes had a vacant, glassy look. "You okay?" I asked, trying to mask the growing tension in my voice. She turned to me slowly, her expression blank. "I'm fine," she said, but her tone was devoid of emotion. We drove in silence for another few miles until she spoke again. "You can drop me off here," she said suddenly. I frowned. "Here?" We were in the middle of nowhere, the highway flanked by dense woods on either side. There wasn't a house, gas station, or even a streetlight in sight. "Yes," she said firmly. "Here." Reluctantly, I slowed down and pulled over to the side of the road. She opened the door and stepped out into the rain without another word. I waited, expecting her to walk toward a hidden path or maybe a car I hadn't noticed, but she just stood there, clutching her suitcase. "Are you sure you'll be okay?" I called out, but she didn't respond. She just stood there, staring at the woods. Uneasy, I decided to leave. As I pulled back onto the road, I glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see her still standing there. But she was gone. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. There hadn't been enough time for her to disappear into the woods, and I hadn't heard the suitcase hit the ground. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. I tried to shake it off and focus on the drive, but the unease lingered. The rain seemed heavier now, the darkness more oppressive. Every shadow on the road looked like it could be her. About 30 minutes later, my headlights caught something up ahead. My stomach dropped when I realized it was her, standing on the shoulder of the road, suitcase in hand. There was no way she could have gotten here before me. My foot hovered over the brake, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. As I drove past her, I glanced at her face. She was smiling. It wasn't a kind or grateful smile. It was a wide, unnatural grin that sent chills down my spine. Her eyes locked onto mine as I sped past, and for a moment, I thought I heard laughter, faint and distorted, over the sound of the rain. I didn't look back. I drove as fast as I dared, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The rain turned into a downpour, and the road ahead became harder to see. My heart pounded as I glanced at the passenger seat, half expecting her to be sitting there again. But it was empty. Just when I thought I was in the clear, the radio crackled to life. Static filled the car, followed by a faint voice, her voice. "Why didn't you stop?" it said, barely a whisper. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding on the wet pavement. The voice was gone, replaced by silence. My hands shook as I turned off the radio, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't see her again for the rest of the drive, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still there, watching me from the shadows. By the time I reached my apartment, the rain had stopped, and the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I never told anyone about that night. I don't know who or what she was, and I don't want to know. But every time I drive that stretch of highway, especially in the rain, I find myself glancing at the shoulder, half expecting to see her standing there, suitcase in hand. And I know that if I do, I won't stop. Not again. It was late September, just as summer gave way to fall, and I had decided to take a solo trip up to a small cabin my family owned by Lake Ironwood in Michigan. I needed a break, a few days away from the stress of my corporate job, and there was northwest better place to clear my head than the peaceful isolation of the woods. The cabin was old but sturdy, nestled deep in a dense forest with the lake just a short walk away. There were no neighbors for miles, no cell service, and the only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the occasional call of a loon. It was perfect. The first couple of days were uneventful. I spent my time fishing, reading, and sitting by the fireplace as the rain drizzled steadily outside. It rained a lot that week, but I didn't mind. There was something soothing about the sound of raindrops on the tin roof. But on the third night, the rain changed. It came harder, heavier, pounding against the windows with an urgency that made it difficult to relax. The wind howled through the trees, and the lake, which had been calm and still during the day, now churned violently, its waves slapping against the shore. That was the first night I heard the knocking. It started around midnight, faint at first, like someone gently tapping on the front door. I was sitting by the fireplace, nursing a cup of tea, when the sound broke through the storm's noise. My first thought was that it must have been a tree branch blown against the cabin, but when I stood and listened more closely, I realized it was too deliberate. 3 soft knocks. Then silence. I approached the door cautiously, peering out through the peephole, but there was nothing there. Just the rain-soaked porch and the shadowy outline of the woods beyond. I waited a moment, listening, but the knocking didn't return. I went back to the fire, telling myself it was nothing, but the unease lingered. I locked the door, something I rarely did out there, and tried to push the sound out of my mind. The next morning, the rain continued. Thick gray clouds hung low over the lake, and the wind carried a chill that made it feel like November rather than September. I spent most of the day inside, catching up on some reading and trying to ignore the creeping sense of dread that had settled over me since the previous night. Around midday, I decided to go for a walk down to the lake. The air was damp, and the forest floor was slick with mud and fallen leaves. As I neared the shoreline, something caught my eye, footprints in the mud, leading from the water up toward the cabin. They were large, too large to be mine, and they had a strange, dragging quality, as though whoever had made them was limping or carrying something heavy. The sight of them sent a shiver down my spine. I looked around, but the woods were empty. I followed the tracks back toward the cabin, my heart racing with each step. They stopped just short of the porch, circling the building once before disappearing into the trees. Whoever, or whatever, had been here last night had been watching the cabin. That night, the knocking returned. It was louder this time, more insistent. 3 knocks, followed by a pause, then 3 more. I stayed frozen in my chair, my hands gripping the blanket draped over my lap. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaking. The knocking stopped, replaced by the faint sound of movement outside. I stood and crept toward the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The porch was empty, but I thought I saw something, just a shadow, dart between the trees. I didn't sleep that night. The knocking continued at irregular intervals, always in threes, and once or twice, I thought I heard faint whispers carried on the wind. The next morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed my things and loaded up the car, ready to leave the cabin behind and return to the safety of the city. But as I opened the driver's side door, I froze. The windshield was covered in long, jagged scratches, deep enough to cut into the glass but not shatter it. They formed no discernible pattern, just chaotic, angry lines. My stomach twisted as I realized the car wouldn't be going anywhere. I spent the day trying to distract myself, but the tension in the air was suffocating. The rain hadn't let up, and the sky was growing darker by the hour. By the time night fell, I was a bundle of nerves, jumping at every sound. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, the knocking returned. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was on the window. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The curtain was drawn, but I could see the outline of a hand pressed against the glass, long fingers splayed out as if feeling for a way inside. "Go away!" I shouted, grabbing the nearest object, a fire poker, and brandishing it like a weapon. The hand slid down the glass, leaving behind a faint, wet streak. The knocking stopped, but the sense of being watched didn't. I could feel eyes on me, piercing through the walls of the cabin. I didn't sleep that night, sitting with my back to the wall and the fire poker clutched tightly in my hands. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the sun was beginning to break through the clouds. I stepped outside cautiously, my heart pounding as I surveyed the area. The footprints were back, deeper and more pronounced than before, circling the cabin in erratic loops. They led down to the lake, where they disappeared into the water. I didn't wait to find out if they'd return. I grabbed what I could carry and hiked to the nearest ranger station, leaving the cabin and the car behind. I never went back to Lake Ironwood. When my family asked why, I told them it was because of the weather, that the rain had ruined the trip. I didn't tell them about the knocking, the scratches, or the figure at the window. But sometimes, late at night, when the rain pounds against my apartment windows, I think about that hand on the glass. And I wonder if it ever stopped watching. It was the kind of cold that clawed through every layer of clothing, no matter how much you bundled up. January in northern Montana was unrelenting, and as the sole paramedic on duty that evening, I wasn't expecting a quiet night. Snowstorms had a way of stirring up chaos in ways you couldn't predict. I'd just finished a call, a routine slip on the ice, and was driving back to the station when the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. "Unit 3, we have a call just outside Snowline Pass. Single vehicle accident, driver unresponsive. State trooper already en route. Coordinates sent." I frowned. Snowline Pass was notorious for its sharp turns and steep drop-offs. Even with guardrails, it wasn't forgiving, especially in a storm like this one. The thought of heading up there wasn't appealing, but duty was duty. I confirmed the call and adjusted my route. The drive was treacherous. The snow fell so heavily that my headlights barely pierced the white haze. The winding road up the pass seemed narrower than I remembered, and my tires skidded more than once. By the time I spotted the faint red and blue glow of the troopers' lights, my nerves were already on edge. As I pulled up, I saw the wreck, a black sedan, front end crumpled against a pine tree. Its rear wheels hung precariously over the edge of the embankment. The trooper, a younger guy I didn't recognize, stood a few feet away, flashlight pointed at the vehicle. "About time," he said, his breath visible in the frigid air. "Been trying to get a response out of them, but no luck. It's weird, though." "Weird how?" I asked, grabbing my gear. "The engine's still running, and the doors are locked, but there's no one behind the wheel." That gave me pause. "What do you mean no one's in there?" He shrugged, shivering. "See for yourself." I approached the car cautiously, the snow crunching under my boots. Sure enough, the driver's seat was empty. The airbag hadn't deployed, and the windshield wasn't cracked, which suggested a relatively slow impact. Still, something about the scene felt off. The passenger side window was frosted over, but a smear near the bottom caught my eye. It looked like someone had pressed their hand against the glass from the inside. I glanced back at the trooper. "Did you check the area?" "Maybe they wandered off looking for help." "Yeah, I did a quick sweep," he said. "No footprints in the snow except mine and now yours." A chill crept up my spine that had nothing to do with the weather. I circled the car, shining my flashlight into the surrounding woods. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches heavy with snow. The wind whistled faintly, carrying with it a sound I couldn't quite place. It wasn't until I stopped and strained to listen that I realized it was a voice. A faint, rhythmic murmur. "Do you hear that?" I asked the trooper, but he was busy radioing for backup. I followed the sound, stepping carefully through the snow. It led me down a narrow trail I hadn't noticed before, partially hidden by the underbrush. The farther I went, the louder it became, a soft, haunting hum, like a lullaby sung just out of earshot. About 50 yards in, I found her. A woman, barefoot and dressed in a thin nightgown, standing in the snow. Her back was to me, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Her dark hair cascaded down her back, and I could see the faint rise and fall of her shoulders as she breathed. "Ma'am." I called out, my voice shaky. She didn't respond. I stepped closer, my boots crunching loudly in the stillness. "Ma'am, are you hurt? Were you in the car?" She turned her head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of her profile. Her skin was pale, too pale, and her eyes, they didn't look quite right. They were wide and unfocused, like she was staring at something far beyond me. I froze. Every instinct screamed at me to turn around and leave, but my training kept me rooted. "I'm here to help," I said, taking another step. That's when she moved. Not toward me, but away, her bare feet making no sound as she glided deeper into the woods. I followed, calling after her, but she didn't stop. Her humming grew louder, more distorted, like a warped record playing on an old phonograph. I lost sight of her when the trail curved sharply, and for a moment, I debated going back. But then I saw it, a second set of footprints in the snow, larger and heavier than hers. They hadn't been there before. My heart pounded as I realized they were heading straight toward me. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. The trail was empty, the woods silent. Even the humming had stopped. Panic set in. I retraced my steps, slipping and stumbling in my haste to get back to the road. When I finally emerged from the trees, the trooper was waiting by his car, his expression unreadable. "You okay?" he asked. I didn't answer. I climbed into my ambulance, locked the doors, and radioed the dispatcher to call off the search. The car could stay where it was. Whoever, or whatever, had been in it wasn't coming back. It was supposed to be a simple weekend retreat. My friends and I, Sam, Erica, and Josh, had been planning it for weeks. We were all in desperate need of a break, and Sam's family owned a cabin deep in the woods of West Virginia. It was the perfect escape, no cell service, no distractions, just a cozy cabin, hiking trails, and a chance to unwind. The weather forecast had warned of rain, but we didn't care. We loaded up Sam's SUV with gear, snacks, and enough firewood to last us a week. The drive out was filled with laughter and music, and by the time we reached the cabin, the sky was already a muted gray, heavy with the promise of rain. The cabin was small but charming, with a wraparound porch and a stone fireplace. It sat on the edge of a clearing, surrounded by dense woods that stretched as far as the eye could see. The only road in was a narrow dirt path that was nearly overgrown, making it feel like we were truly cut off from the world. The first night was uneventful. We cooked dinner over the fire, told stories, and played cards until the rain started around midnight. The sound of raindrops on the roof was soothing, and we all fell asleep quickly, lulled by the rhythmic patter. The next day, the rain continued, steady but not heavy enough to keep us inside. We decided to explore the area, following a trail that wound through the woods and led to a small creek about a mile from the cabin. The air was cool and damp, the kind of weather that made everything smell earthy and alive. As we walked, Erica stopped suddenly, holding up a hand. "Do you hear that?" she asked. We all paused, listening. At first, there was nothing but the sound of rain dripping from the leaves. Then, faintly, we heard it, a low, guttural humming, like someone humming a tune just out of earshot. "What is that?" Josh muttered, looking around. "No idea," Sam said, frowning. "Probably the wind." But it didn't sound like the wind. The sound followed us as we continued down the trail, growing louder and then fading again, as if it were moving with us. By the time we reached the creek, the sound had stopped, but the unease lingered. That night, the rain picked up, hammering against the roof and windows with an intensity that made it hard to hear anything else. We stayed inside, playing board games and trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that had settled over the group. Around midnight, the power went out. We scrambled to find flashlights and candles, laughing nervously as we lit the room. "It's just the storm," Sam said, trying to sound reassuring. "The power lines out here aren't great." But then we heard it, the humming. It was louder now, unmistakable, and it wasn't coming from the storm. It was coming from outside. Josh grabbed a flashlight and moved to the window, peering out into the rain-soaked clearing. "I don't see anything," he said, though his voice was tight. "Probably just animals." Erica shook her head. "What kind of animal hums?" No one had an answer. The sound continued for hours, fluctuating between barely audible and so loud it seemed to vibrate through the walls. None of us could sleep. We sat in the living room, huddled together with flashlights and kitchen knives, trying to convince ourselves that it was nothing. But then, around 3 a.m., the humming stopped. And the knocking began. It was soft at first, just a single knock at the front door. We all froze, staring at each other. Sam grabbed the biggest knife from the kitchen and motioned for Josh to check the door. Josh shook his head, refusing to move. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by another knock at the back door. "There's more than one," Erica whispered, her voice trembling. I crept to the window, pulling back the curtain just enough to peek outside. The rain made it hard to see, but I thought I saw movement at the edge of the clearing, dark shapes shifting between the trees. "Who's out there?" Sam shouted, his voice shaking with both fear and anger. There was no response, just another knock, this time at the window. I swung the flashlight beam toward the glass, and for a brief second, I saw it, a pale face, gaunt and expressionless, staring in at us. Its eyes were dark and hollow, and its lips were slightly parted as if it were about to speak. I dropped the flashlight, my hands shaking. "There's someone out there," I whispered. The knocking stopped. We stayed awake until dawn, clutching our makeshift weapons and jumping at every creak of the cabin. When the first light of morning broke through the rain, we ventured outside, our nerves frayed. The clearing was empty. There were no footprints, no signs of anyone, or anything, having been there. But as we circled the cabin, we found something etched into the wood of the front door, a series of strange, intersecting symbols, like a crude, jagged star. We packed up and left immediately, driving back to town in tense silence. None of us wanted to talk about what had happened. The rain followed us all the way home, and even now, years later, I can't hear the sound of rain without thinking of that cabin. Sometimes I wonder if those symbols were a warning or a message, if the humming was meant to draw us out or keep us in. But mostly, I wonder what would have happened if we'd opened the door. And I'm glad we didn't. It was the last weekend in October, and I had finally convinced my friends to join me on a camping trip. The weather forecast predicted light rain, but we figured it wouldn't be too bad. We'd camped in worse conditions before, and the remote hiking trails in northern Oregon were too beautiful to resist. There were 4 of us, me, my best friend Mike, his girlfriend Sarah, and her younger brother Jake. We planned to hike about 6 miles into the woods to a secluded spot by a river, spend the weekend fishing and sitting around the fire, and head back Sunday morning. It was supposed to be a fun, relaxing trip, a chance to unplug and escape from the stress of city life. But it didn't take long for things to start feeling off. The hike began uneventfully. The forest was quiet except for the occasional chirp of birds and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. The rain started as a light drizzle, the kind that made the trail muddy but manageable. We laughed and joked as we trudged along, our backpacks heavy with gear and supplies. About 3 miles in, we came to a fork in the trail. The map showed that both paths would eventually lead to the river, but one was significantly shorter. Jake suggested taking the shortcut, eager to set up camp before the rain got worse. It seemed like a good idea at the time. The shortcut was narrower and more overgrown than the main trail, and the trees grew so close together that they blocked out most of the light. The drizzle turned into steady rain, and the muddy path became increasingly difficult to navigate. We were forced to slow down, our boots sinking into the slick ground with every step. About an hour into the shortcut, Sarah stopped abruptly. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the rain. We all paused, straining to listen. For a moment, there was nothing but the sound of rain hitting the leaves. Then, faintly, we heard it, a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone beating a drum deep in the forest. "What the hell is that?" Mike muttered, looking around nervously. Jake laughed, trying to lighten the mood. "Probably just some hunters messing around." But none of us were convinced. The sound followed us as we continued down the trail, growing louder and more erratic. It wasn't coming from any specific direction, it seemed to echo from all around us, as if the forest itself was alive with the noise. The rain intensified, and the muddy trail became almost impassable, but we pressed on, too far in to turn back. By the time we reached the river, the sun was beginning to set, and the forest was shrouded in shadows. We quickly set up our tents and started a fire, desperate for warmth and light. The thumping had stopped, but the unease lingered. That night, as we sat around the fire, the conversation was subdued. The rain had tapered off to a light drizzle, and the forest was eerily silent. Even the usual nighttime sounds, crickets, owls, the rustling of leaves, were absent. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Then, around midnight, we heard it again. The thumping. It was louder this time, closer. We all froze, our eyes darting toward the darkness beyond the firelight. The sound was coming from the direction of the trail we'd hiked in on, but there was no movement, no sign of anyone approaching. "Maybe it's an animal," Sarah whispered, clutching her brother's arm. "What kind of animal makes that noise?" Mike shot back, his voice tense. No one had an answer. The sound grew louder and more erratic, as if whatever was making it was circling our campsite. I grabbed a flashlight and shone it into the woods, the beam cutting through the rain and illuminating the trees. For a moment, I thought I saw something, just a shadow, tall and thin, darting between the trunks. "It's just the rain playing tricks on your eyes," I told myself, but my hands were shaking as I lowered the flashlight. We decided to take turns keeping watch, unwilling to go to sleep with that sound still echoing in the darkness. My turn came around 3 a.m. The others were huddled in their tents, the fire reduced to glowing embers. I sat on a log, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline, and tried to stay alert. That's when I saw it. A figure, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the firelight. It was tall and motionless, its features obscured by the shadows. For a moment, I thought it might be a person, maybe a lost hiker or another camper. But something about the way it stood, too still, too rigid, made my skin crawl. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. It didn't respond. It didn't move. I shone the flashlight toward it, and as the beam hit its form, it vanished. One moment it was there, the next it was gone, as if it had melted into the darkness. I stumbled backward, nearly dropping the flashlight, my heart pounding in my chest. When I woke the others and told them what I'd seen, they didn't believe me, at least, not at first. But then we found the footprints. They were scattered around the edge of the clearing, deep impressions in the muddy ground. They weren't shaped like any animal prints I'd ever seen, long and narrow, with claw-like marks at the tips. We didn't wait for sunrise. We packed up our gear and left the campsite, hiking back to the main trail as quickly as we could. The rain had picked up again, making the trek miserable, but none of us cared. We just wanted to get out of those woods. The thumping followed us the entire way, growing fainter as we neared the main trail. By the time we reached the car, the sound had stopped, and the forest was silent once more. We never spoke about what happened that night, not in detail. None of us could explain it, and none of us wanted to try. But sometimes, when it rains, I think about that shadow by the firelight, the footprints in the mud, and the sound of that haunting, rhythmic thumping. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next visitors. It was a late spring night in 2018, and I was alone in the old farmhouse I'd inherited from my grandparents. The property sat on the outskirts of a small town in Iowa, surrounded by fields that stretched for miles. There weren't any neighbors nearby, just the occasional passing car on the highway about half a mile away. That night, a storm was rolling in, the kind that seemed to make the whole world vibrate. The wind howled through the trees, and rain pelted the windows in relentless sheets. Thunder rumbled in the distance, growing closer with each passing hour. I was curled up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea, trying to distract myself with a movie. It was just past 11 p.m. when I heard the knock. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the sound of the storm. I paused the movie and listened. The knock came again, louder this time, 3 sharp raps on the front door. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. No one ever came out here unannounced, especially not at this hour. The driveway was long and muddy from the rain, and anyone trying to reach the house would have had a hard time making it without getting stuck. I grabbed my phone and walked to the door, hesitating before looking through the peephole. All I could see was darkness, the porch light flickering weakly against the rain. "Hello," I called through the door, my voice shaking. There was no response. I waited, listening, but all I could hear was the storm. "Who's there?" I tried again. Still nothing. I stood there for a moment, my hand hovering over the lock, before I decided it was best to ignore it. Whoever it was could wait until morning, if they were even still there. I went back to the couch, but the uneasy feeling lingered. I turned the movie back on, but I couldn't focus. My eyes kept drifting to the front window, half expecting to see someone standing there. The wind howled louder, and the power flickered, plunging the room into brief moments of total darkness. And then, the knock came again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the window. I shot up from the couch, my heart pounding. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint outline of a figure standing just outside the glass. I grabbed my phone, fumbling to dial 911, but stopped when I realized something strange. The figure wasn't moving. It wasn't trying to look inside or knock again. It was just standing there. Summoning every ounce of courage I had, I crept toward the window, pulling the curtain back just an inch. My breath caught in my throat. It was a man, tall and thin, his face obscured by the shadow of a hood. Rain dripped from his clothes, pooling on the porch. His head was tilted slightly, as if he were listening for something. I dropped the curtain and backed away, my mind racing. Why wasn't he saying anything? Why hadn't he left after I didn't answer the door? I called the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. The dispatcher assured me that an officer was on the way, but it would take at least 20 minutes given the storm. 20 minutes felt like an eternity. I stayed in the living room, clutching a fireplace poker I'd grabbed from the hearth. The man hadn't moved. I could feel his presence, even without looking. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the windows, made my pulse race. Then, I heard it. Footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, moving around the side of the house. I followed the sound, creeping toward the back window. When I peeked out, he was there, standing in the backyard, staring at the house. I couldn't see his face, but I could feel his gaze, heavy and unrelenting. He tilted his head again, like he was studying me through the walls. The police couldn't arrive fast enough. I stayed hidden, every second feeling like an hour. Finally, the sound of sirens pierced through the storm, and red and blue lights flashed against the rain-streaked windows. I ran to the front door, throwing it open as two officers approached. I tried to explain what had happened, gesturing toward the backyard, but when we went to check, the man was gone. The officers searched the property and the surrounding area, but they found no sign of him. No footprints in the mud, no disturbed grass, nothing to suggest anyone had been there at all. Could have been the storm playing tricks on you, one of them said kindly, but I could tell he didn't believe it himself. After they left, I locked every door and window, double-checking each one before retreating to my bedroom. I didn't sleep that night. The storm raged on, and every shadow seemed to move, every sound seemed to whisper his presence. By morning, the rain had stopped, and the sun broke through the clouds, but the unease remained. When I stepped outside to inspect the property, I found something that made my blood run cold. Scratched into the wooden porch, just below the window where he'd been standing, were 3 words, "I know you." I moved out of that house a month later, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The new owners never reported anything unusual, but I still think about that night whenever a storm rolls in. And I wonder if he's still out there, waiting for me to be alone again. Thank you for watching. Consider subscribing.